The penthouse suite at St. James Hotels always felt like the peak of Manhattan luxury, a sanctuary of quiet perfection where the city lights reflected softly off the crystal decanter on the mahogany bar. But the notification that just lit up Cole's phone wasn't a late-night corporate memo. It was a frantic buried email from the wife he had erased from his existence a year ago begging for closure. He slowly flipped the device face down, his gaze shifting to the sleeping silhouette of the woman tangled in his sheets, the very woman his ex-wife had spent her entire life worshiping from afar. If you find yourself drawn to these quiet, dangerous intersections of betrayal and new beginnings, stay with me as the rest of this story unfolds. The silence in the executive office of the St. James Hotel was absolute, save for the faint rhythmic ticking of a vintage Patek Philippe resting on the mahogany desk. Cole Williams stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of amber bourbon held loosely in his hand. 50 stories below Manhattan was a chaotic blur of taillights in yellow cabs, a city that thrived on noise. But up here, Cole had engineered an environment of total suffocating control. It had been exactly 312 days since he walked out of his home in Chicago. 312 days since he found the secondary phone hidden in Amanda's makeup vanity. He hadn't screamed. He hadn't broken the mirror. He had simply read the graphic, desperate messages between his wife and Brock Steele, placed the phone back precisely where he found it, packed a single duffel bag, and disappeared into the ether. No note, no screaming matches, just a void where her husband used to be. He took a slow sip of the bourbon, letting the burn anchor him to the present. His phone vibrated against the desk, a single soft buzz. He didn't need to look at the screen to know what it was. Amanda's emails still found their way through his heavily filtered spam folders every few weeks. Cole, please. Just tell me you're alive. Brock was a mistake. The silence is killing me. He let the screen fade to black. The silence was meant to kill her. It was the only weapon he had left. A soft knock drew him from the glass. Mr. Williams. Cole turned his expression, instantly smoothing into the impenetrable mask of a luxury hospitality executive. Yes, Sarah, come in. His assistant stepped in, holding a leather-bound tablet. Miss Taylor's security detail just cleared the lobby. She's utilizing the private elevator to the penthouse now. Her team requested that all floor staff be minimized for the evening. She's apparently had a very long press day. Understood, Cole murmured, setting his glass down. Ensure the night staff avoids the 50th floor unless explicitly called. I'll review her itinerary for tomorrow's gala. Of course, sir. Sarah hesitated, lingering by the door. Should I send up the usual welcome amenities? No, Cole said, his voice quiet but firm. She specifically requested no champagne, no floral arrangements. Just sparkling water in the room at exactly 68 degrees. Sarah nodded and quietly exited the heavy oak door, clicking shut behind her. Cole loosened his tie, his mind drifting to the woman currently ascending to the penthouse. Brooklyn Taylor. She was a titan in the lifestyle and fashion industry, a woman whose mere endorsement could launch a brand into the stratosphere. She was also the woman Amanda had built her entire aesthetic around. Amanda's hair, her wardrobe, the very cadence of her voice in social settings, it was all a carefully curated imitation of Brooklyn Taylor. It was a cruel poetic irony that Cole was now personally overseeing the idol his cheating wife worshipped. He glanced at his watch. 11:45 p.m. The hotel was settling into its nocturnal rhythm. He should have gone down to his own suite, but a strange restlessness gnawed at his chest. He picked up his master key card and stepped out of his office, the thick carpet swallowing the sound of his footsteps. As he walked past the VIP lounge, a dimly lit, velvet-draped sanctuary meant to be closed at this hour, he noticed the heavy double doors were slightly ajar. A sliver of warm golden light spilled into the corridor. Cole pushed the door open, ready to reprimand a stray staff member. Instead, he stopped dead in his tracks, sitting alone at the edge of the polished brass bar, barefoot and still wearing a stunning, albeit slightly wrinkled emerald evening gown, was Brooklyn Taylor. She wasn't looking at her phone. She wasn't posing. She was just staring blankly at the empty crystal glass in front of her, the heavy weight of exhaustion pulling down the corners of her striking eyes. She looked up at the sound of the door, her guard instantly snapping into place, the famous impenetrable smile forming on her lips. But in the fraction of a second before she adjusted, Cole saw it. The profound, suffocating loneliness. The exact same expression he saw in the mirror every morning. The bar is closed, I assume. Her voice was softer than it sounded on television, raspy with fatigue. Cole stood in the doorway, the ghosts of his past momentarily silenced by the quiet intensity of her gaze. "For the public, yes," he replied, his voice a low murmur in the empty room. "But I find the rules are somewhat flexible past midnight." Brooklyn's shoulders relaxed fractionally at his response, though the guarded wariness in her eyes remained. She let out a breath that sounded more like a sigh of defeat, her gaze dropping back to the empty glass. "Then I suppose I am at the mercy of the management." Cole stepped fully into the lounge, letting the heavy door shut behind him with a soft thud that sealed them off from the rest of the world. The silence in the room was dense, insulated by the velvet curtains and thick carpets. He walked behind the polished brass bar, the ambient lighting casting long, shifting shadows across his face. "Cole Williams, managing director," he said quietly, offering no handshake. The distance between them across the bar felt like an unspoken boundary line. "Brooklyn," she replied. A faint, almost bitter smile touched her lips. "But you already know that. Everyone in this building seems to know exactly who I am, what I need and where I am at all times." "It's our job to anticipate," Cole murmured, reaching beneath the counter. He remembered the strict instructions from her team. No alcohol. He retrieved a bottle of sparkling water and poured it into a fresh, crystal glass, adding a single twist of lemon. He slid it across the mahogany surface toward her. Brooklyn stared at the water. A flicker of genuine surprise crossed her features before she looked up at him. "No pitch for the reserve champagne. The last 3 hotels I stayed at practically drowned me in Dom Perignon, hoping for a tag on Instagram." "You requested sparkling water in a cold room," Cole said, his voice flat professional, yet carrying an undercurrent of understanding. "I find that people who spend their entire day being watched usually just want to be left alone when the cameras are off." Brooklyn's fingers curled around the glass. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the climate control system and the distant muffled wail of a siren miles below. She took a slow sip, the cold water grounding her. Up close, Cole could see the intricate beadwork of her emerald gown, heavy and constricting. He also saw the faint dark circles beneath her meticulously applied makeup, the physical toll of being an empire. "It's exhausting," she whispered almost to herself. It was a dangerous admission, one she clearly rarely made. Smiling until your jaw aches, selling a version of perfection that doesn't actually exist. Cole's jaw tightened. Perfection that doesn't exist. The words struck a raw nerve, pulling a ghost of Amanda's curated laughter into the forefront of his mind. Amanda, who had bought Brooklyn's books, worn Brooklyn's recommended shades of lipstick, and ultimately built a hollow marriage on the very lies this woman was paid to sell. "Perfection is a commodity," Cole said, his tone turning a fraction colder, his gaze fixed on the mahogany bar. "People buy it because the alternative is dealing with the ugly reality of their own lives. You sell them an escape. You shouldn't feel guilty for that." Brooklyn studied him. The celebrity facade completely vanished, replaced by a sharp, piercing intelligence. She recognized the bitterness in his voice, the careful, deliberate way he held himself like a man who had survived a collapse but was still bracing for the aftershocks. "I'm not talking about them," she said softly, her eyes locking onto his. "I'm talking about me. Who sells the escape to the person selling the escape?" Cole looked up. Their eyes met, and in that quiet, dimly lit space, a silent recognition passed between them. It was the shared vocabulary of the deeply isolated. He saw a woman trapped in a gilded cage of her own making. She saw a man who had turned his heart into a fortress. "I don't know," Cole finally answered, the professional veneer slipping just enough to reveal the fractured man beneath. "But I imagine it starts with a locked door and a glass of water." Brooklyn offered a small, genuine smile, the first real expression he had seen from hers. She slipped her bare feet back into her stilettos, the illusion of the mogul slowly reassembling itself. "Good night, Mr. Williams." "Good night, Miss Taylor." Cole watched her leave, the rustle of her silk gown the only sound in the empty lounge. When the doors clicked shut, he remained behind the bar, the silence returning, but the air feeling noticeably heavier than before. The private elevator to the 50th floor moved in absolute frictionless silence. Cole watched the digital numbers climb, telling himself that this was merely a routine security check. The PR event in the hotel's lower banquet hall had ended an hour ago, a grueling 5-hour marathon of flashbulbs, forced laughter, and relentless networking. As managing director, ensuring the VIP floor was secured was his job. That was the lie he repeated to the polished steel doors. When he stepped into the penthouse corridor, he found the heavy double doors of Brooklyn's suite unlocked, resting a fraction of an inch ajar. A severe security breach. Cole's jaw tightened. He pushed the door open, the reprimand for her security detail already forming on his tongue, but the words died in his throat. The suite was bathed in the cold blue light of the Manhattan skyline. Brooklyn was sitting on the floor, leaning against the base of the floor-to-ceiling window, her knees pulled to her chest. The flawless mogul from the banquet hall was gone. She was wearing an oversized cashmere sweater and silk pajama pants, her hair a tangled mess, the heavy stage makeup scrubbed raw from her face. A few feet away, her smartphone buzzed violently against the hardwood floor, lighting up with a barrage of incoming calls and messages. She didn't even look at it. She just stared out at the sprawling grid of the city, looking infinitesimally small against the towering glass. "What's Taylor?" Cole's voice was low, careful not to shatter the fragile quiet. She flinched slightly, turning her head. Her eyes were red rimmed, stripped of the manufactured confidence she sold to millions of women like Amanda, who chased this very illusion to the point of ruining their own lives. "I told them to leave me alone," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My manager, my publicist, the investors, they don't stop. They want the next book, the next launch, the next piece of me until there's nothing left." Cole stepped fully into the room, letting the door click shut and lock behind him. He looked at the buzzing phone, the relentless demands of a world that worshipped a phantom. Slowly, he walked over, picked up the device, and held down the power button until the screen went completely black. The sudden absence of the vibration felt like a physical release in the room. He set the dead phone on the coffee table and moved toward the window. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell her it would be fine, because he knew intimately that sometimes it wasn't. Instead, Cole broke the one rule he had lived by for the past 313 days. He allowed himself to close the distance. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, carefully folding his tall frame to sit on the floor beside her. He left a foot of space between them, a respectful boundary, but his presence was an anchor in the vast empty suite. "You don't have to be her right now," Cole said softly, looking out at the city rather than at her, giving her the dignity of privacy. "For tonight, you don't owe anyone a single piece of yourself. The world stops at that door." Brooklyn let out a shaky breath, the tension slowly draining from her shoulders. She turned her head, studying his profile, the sharp jawline, the guarded eyes, the quiet strength of a man who understood the weight of keeping everything locked inside. "Who broke you, Cole?" she asked, the question slipping out into the dark, raw, and unfiltered. Cole's breath hitched imperceptibly. The sound of his first name on her lips felt dangerous. He thought of the empty house in Chicago, the secondary phone, the suffocating betrayal. Someone who thought the truth wasn't enough. He finally answered, his voice a gravelly whisper. Slowly, hesitantly, Brooklyn leaned sideways, letting the side of her head come to rest lightly against his shoulder. Cole froze for a fraction of a second. He hadn't been touched in a year. The warmth of her beside him was terrifying, a spark in a house he had deliberately flooded. But as she let out a long, exhausted sigh, Cole didn't pull away. He simply sat there in the dark, guarding the broken idol his wife had worshipped, while the ice around his own chest began terrifyingly to crack. The transition from rigid professional boundaries to a private consuming affair had not been a sudden explosion, but rather a slow, inevitable slide into deep water. 3 weeks had passed since Brooklyn extended her residency at the St. James. To the hotel staff, she was the demanding VIP on the 50th floor. To the board of directors, Cole was the stoic managing director, ensuring their most lucrative guests remained satisfied. But behind the heavy oak doors of the penthouse, the script was entirely different. Rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the bedroom window, distorting the neon glow of the Manhattan skyline into bleeding streaks of red and gold. Inside the room was a sanctuary of dim light and tangled silk. Cole lay on his back, the cool air of the suite, a sharp contrast to the lingering heat of their bodies. Brooklyn was curled against his side, her head resting on his chest, tracing absent-minded patterns over his collarbone. There was no makeup, no lighting crews, no PR managers pacing the hallway. There was only the steady, rhythmic sound of his heartbeat beneath her fingertips. "If your board of directors knew you were up here, Brooklyn murmured, her voice thick with sleep. They would have your keycard deactivated by morning. If your publicist knew you were sleeping with a man who has zero social media presence and no recognizable net worth. Cole countered quietly, his fingers gently tangling in her hair. She would have a mild stroke. Brooklyn let out a soft, breathy laugh, though the undercurrent of truth hung heavy in the room. They were playing a dangerous, fragile game. For Cole, fraternizing with a high-profile guest was a catastrophic breach of corporate ethics, a termination-level offense that would shatter the sterile, controlled life he had painstakingly built from the ashes of his marriage. For Brooklyn, an undocumented, unvetted romance was a liability to an empire built on the illusion of independent, untouchable perfection. Yet the risk was precisely what bound them. In a world that demanded everything from them, this secret was the only thing that belonged entirely to them. Cole shifted slightly, his gaze drifting to the shadows of the ceiling. A dark, twisted irony gnawed at the edges of his conscience. He was holding the very woman his ex-wife had spent years trying to become. Amanda had studied Brooklyn's poise, mimicked her fashion, and quoted her books while simultaneously destroying their marriage in the dark. Now Cole was the one in the dark, discovering the profound, messy, beautiful reality of the woman Amanda only knew as a two-dimensional idol. It felt like karma, or perhaps a quiet, devastating rebellion. "Where did you go just now?" Brooklyn asked softly, sensing the subtle shift in his breathing. She tilted her head up, her piercing eyes searching his face in the gloom. Cole looked down at her. He couldn't tell her about Chicago. He couldn't taint this isolated sanctuary with the ghost of Amanda's betrayal. Not yet. He had spent the last year erasing his past, and he refused to let it bleed into the only pure thing he had found since. "Nowhere," he whispered, brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. He leaned down, pressing a lingering kiss to her forehead, sealing the lie between them. "I'm right here." She rested her head back against his chest, trusting the steady rhythm of his heart over the hesitation in his eyes. Outside, the storm continued to rage over the city, and as Cole stared out at the rain, he knew with absolute certainty that this fragile glass house they had built was bound to shatter. He just didn't know when the first stone would be thrown. The subterranean security control room of the street. James Hotel was a sensory deprivation chamber compared to the opulent chaos of the lobby above. It was a windowless, climate-controlled bunker, humming with the low frequency of server racks and the cool blue glow of 64 high-definition monitors. Cole usually spent 20 minutes here every Friday afternoon, a routine measure to ensure the VIP logistics were flawlessly executed. Today his focus was on camera 4, the main revolving doors. Brooklyn had a fêting at a downtown atelier in an hour, and Cole needed to ensure the lobby was clear of paparazzi before giving her security team the green light. He leaned over the console, his eyes tracking the fluid movement of bellhops and valets. The afternoon sunlight was spilling violently across the marble floors of the lobby feed. Then a woman walked through the revolving glass doors. Cole's breath hitched a sudden microscopic pause in his respiratory system. He froze, his hands gripping the edge of the metal console so tightly his knuckles turned a bloodless white. The woman on the screen is wearing a belted camel hair trench coat draped over her shoulders, her hair styled in effortless loose waves, oversized tortoiseshell sunglasses hiding half her face. To anyone else, she was just another wealthy socialite checking in for a Manhattan weekend. But Cole recognized the coat. He recognized the sunglasses. They were precise, meticulous replicas of the exact outfit Brooklyn Taylor had worn on the cover of Vogue 2 months prior. And as the woman lowered the sunglasses to speak to the concierge, Cole recognized the face. Amanda. The world tilted on its axis, a rush of static filling Cole's ears, drowning out the ambient hum of the server room. 334 days. That was how long he had successfully erased her from the physical world. Yet here she was, standing in the center of his lobby, breathing the air of the sanctuary he had built to survive her. Then came the second blow. Stepping up behind her, handing a platinum credit card to the front desk agent, was a man with broad shoulders and a tailored suit. Brock Steele. Cole felt a cold, venomous spike of adrenaline pierce his chest. The images of the text messages he had found on Amanda's hidden phone flashed behind his eyes, vivid and agonizing. He watched through the silent, grainy feed as Brock leaned in, resting a casual, possessive hand on the small of Amanda's back. Amanda smiled up at him, a flawless picture of affluent domestic bliss. They were checking in for a luxury weekend. Mr. Williams, the voice of the head of security standing just a few feet away, sounded like it was coming from underwater. Cole didn't look away from camera 4. He watched the front desk agent hand Amanda a pair of key cards. "Is there an issue with the lobby feed, sir?" The security chief pressed, noticing the rigid tension locking his boss's frame. Cole forced his lungs to expand, swallowing the bile rising in his throat. He released his death grip on the console, slipping his shaking hands into his trouser pockets to hide them. He summoned every ounce of the cold corporate armor he had forged over the last year. "No," Cole said, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. "Zoom in on reception. Who are the guests checking into the Parkview Suites?" The guard tapped a few keys. "A Mr. Brock Steele and his partner. Weekend reservation. No VIP flags." His partner. The words twisted the knife still lodged deep in Cole's ribs. He watched Amanda and Brock walk toward the guest elevators, blissfully unaware that the god of this particular building, the man who controlled the doors, the cameras, the very air they breathed, was the husband they had destroyed. "Keep an eye on the paparazzi outside," Cole instructed, turning away from the monitors, the heavy metal door of the control room sliding open for him. "Ms. Taylor will be coming down shortly." He stepped out into the concrete hallway, the reality of the situation suffocating him. Amanda was here. Brooklyn was upstairs. The walls of his carefully separated worlds were paper thin, and the match had just been lit. The earpiece resting in Cole's right ear emitted a low burst of static, followed by the crisp, disembodied voice of the security chief. "Lobby clear. Elevators locked on 50. Target is ready to move." "Copy," Cole murmured, his voice a low hum vibrating in his chest. He stood by the polished steel doors of the penthouse elevator waiting. When the doors parted, Brooklyn emerged in the full armor. The vulnerability of the night before was locked away behind oversized designer sunglasses and a flawlessly tailored ivory power suit. Her publicist and 2 assistants trailed closely behind a cloud of frantic energy and rapid-fire scheduling. Cole fell into step beside them, leading the procession toward the mezzanine concourse that bypassed the main lobby. "The car is waiting in the subterranean loading dock," Cole instructed, not looking at Brooklyn playing the part of the detached executive. "It will allow you to exit without crossing the main threshold. Paparazzi are heavily concentrated on Fifth Avenue this morning." "Thank you, Mr. Williams," Brooklyn replied, her tone matching his professional distance. But beneath the sunglasses, he could feel her gaze lingering on the rigid tension of his jaw. She knew him well enough now to sense the subtle shift in his frequency. He was wound too tight a spring, ready to snap. They stepped onto the glass-paneled bridge of the mezzanine overlooking the opulent palm court below, where the morning sunlight fractured through crystal chandeliers. The air smelled of signature sandalwood and freshly ground espresso. Cole's eyes scanned the floor below out of pure instinct, a predator analyzing its territory. Then his blood ran cold. Sitting at a corner table in the palm court directly in their line of sight from the bridge above was Amanda. She was alone, elegantly dressed, sipping from a porcelain teacup while scrolling through her phone. Cole felt a violent constriction in his chest. She was barely 40 feet away, separated only by altitude and a pane of decorative glass. If she tilted her head up, she would see the husband she had been desperately emailing for nearly a year, escorting the idol she had spent a decade obsessing over. Amanda shifted in her chair, her head beginning to rise toward the mezzanine. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like blood in Cole's mouth. Acting purely on adrenaline, he stepped abruptly into Brooklyn's path, pivoting so his broad shoulders completely blocked the view of the floor below. "Stop," Cole said sharply. The sudden halt caused the publicist to stumble, a chorus of confused murmurs breaking out from her team. Brooklyn looked up at him, startled, her lips parting in question. Cole was standing inches from her, his back to the glass, shielding her and himself from the ghost below. He could feel a cold sweat breaking out at the nape of his neck. "Is there a problem, Cole?" Brooklyn asked amply, dropping the formal title, her voice laced with sudden concern. She could see the micro-tremors in his hands. Cole stared down at her, forcing his breathing to remain steady, though his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Security hazard," he lied, his voice terrifyingly calm. "A photographer slipped past the perimeter near the atrium glass. We need to reroute." Without waiting for her team to argue, Cole placed a firm hand on the small of Brooklyn's back. a touch that burned through the fabric of her suit and guided her swiftly toward the heavy unmarked doors of a service elevator. As the steel doors of the service lift ground shut, enclosing them in the harsh fluorescent glare of the back of house, Cole finally exhaled. The publicist was frantically texting, oblivious to the near collapse of Cole's reality. But Brooklyn wasn't looking at her phone, Shaoyuan. She was looking quietly at Cole, watching a single bead of sweat trace down his temple. She knew he was lying about the photographer. Cole stared straight ahead at the metal doors, the claustrophobia of his own hotel suffocating him. He was the god of this building, yet he was running like a fugitive. The psychological toll of Amanda's proximity was a poison slowly seeping into his veins, and he realized with terrifying clarity that the walls between his past and his present were already beginning to crumble. The air in the mezzanine security alcove was thick and cold, smelling faintly of ozone and floor wax. Cole stood in the heavy shadows behind a pane of one-way mirrored glass, his eyes locked onto the brightly lit green room on the other side. Through the earpiece resting in his ear, his assistant, Sarah's voice crackled. "Mr. Williams, we have a last-minute VIP clearance request for Miss Taylor. A Mr. Brock Steele just made a $50,000 donation to her literacy foundation in exchange for a 2-minute introduction for his partner." Cole stared through the glass. Sitting on the plush velvet sofa in the green room, sipping her mandated sparkling water, was Brooklyn. She looked exhausted, mentally preparing for the evening's charity gala, rubbing her temples when she thought no one was watching. "Mr. Williams," Sarah prompted, the silence stretching a fraction too long. "Do I have your authorization to clear the guest?" Cole's hand rested on the aluminum console. If he denied the request, it would flag as an anomaly to Brooklyn's PR team. If he approved it, he would have to watch the collision of his two worlds unfold in real time. He swallowed the jagged shard of glass lodged in his throat. "Clear them," Cole rasped, releasing the mic button before his voice could betray him. Less than a minute later, the heavy oak door of the green room swung open. Amanda stepped inside. Through the glass, Cole watched the woman he had promised to love for the rest of his life. Up close, the imitation was staggering, almost grotesque in its accuracy. Amanda was wearing a silk blouse in the exact shade of ivory Brooklyn had championed in her spring editorial. Her posture, the tilt of her chin, even the hesitant, breathy way she smiled, it was all a pantomime of the woman sitting on the sofa. Brooklyn stood up, pasting on the warm, untouchable smile that belonged to her brand. Cole reached out and turned the dial on the audio feed monitor. The sound of the green room flooded the small, dark alcove. "Ms. Taylor." Amanda's voice filtered through the speakers. Cole closed his eyes, his chest seizing. It was the same voice that had whispered promises in the dark of their Chicago bedroom. The same voice he had heard on the hidden phone recordings, breathlessly begging Brock Steele for more. "Please call me Brooklyn," Brooklyn said graciously, extending a hand. "Thank you for the incredibly generous donation. I understand we have you and Mr. Steele to thank." Amanda took her hand, her eyes shining with a frantic, desperate adoration. "Meeting you it's everything. I've followed your work for years. Your book on reclaiming your narrative, it helped me through a very difficult transition in my life. It gave me the courage to walk away from a suffocating situation and finally be true to myself." A sharp, humorless breath escaped Cole's lips in the dark alcove. A suffocating situation. That was how she was framing her adultery. That was the narrative she had spun to justify tearing their life down to the studs. Through the glass, he watched Brooklyn's expression soften with genuine empathy, entirely unaware that the woman she was comforting was the architect of the very trauma she was currently trying to heal in Cole. "I'm so glad my words could offer you comfort," Brooklyn replied softly, placing a gentle hand on Amanda's arm. "Rebuilding is never easy. It takes a lot of bravery to start over." Amanda nodded, tears welling perfectly in her eyes, a masterclass in performative vulnerability. "I'm Amanda, by the way." "It's a pleasure, Amanda." Cole stood in the dark, watching his past and his present hold hands. The twisted, agonizing irony of the moment threatened to crush the air from his lungs. He reached out with a trembling hand and aggressively twisted the dial, cutting the audio feed, plunging the alcove back into total silence. He turned his back to the glass, pressing his forehead against the cold concrete wall, waiting in the dark for the ghost to leave his house. The St. James Grand Ballroom was a masterpiece of Gilded Age architecture, bathed in the warm amber glow of 10,000 crystal prisms suspended from the vaulted ceiling. The air was thick with the scent of roasted truffles, expensive perfume, and the low, continuous hum of Manhattan's elite exchanging pleasantries. It was an environment designed to project absolute perfection. Cole stood completely still in the architectural shadows of a massive marble pillar near the South Service doors. To the waitstaff slipping past him with silver trays, he was the vigilant managing director. But inside, he was a ghost haunting his own purgatory. His eyes were locked immovably on table one. Because of Brock Steele's $50,000 donation, the event organizers had seated him and Amanda directly at the guest of honor's table. Cole watched the macabre pantomime unfold through the flicker of the candelabras. Brooklyn sat at the center, radiating a quiet, untouchable elegance in a high-necked black velvet gown. To her left sat Brock, looking slightly bored, his heavy, gold-ringed hand resting possessively on the back of Amanda's chair. And there was Amanda leaning in, her face flushed with the thrill of proximity, hanging on to every polite, manufactured word Brooklyn spoke. Cole's jaw ached from how hard his teeth were clenched. He watched Brock lean over and whisper something into Amanda's ear. Amanda threw her head back in a practiced, airy laugh, the exact same laugh she used to reserve for Cole's jokes across their kitchen island in Chicago. The visceral familiarity of it felt like a serrated blade dragging slowly across his ribs. This is what you let me die for, Cole thought, the bitterness, a cold poison in his veins. For a man who buys you a seat at a table and a woman you're desperately trying to become. From the center of the room, Brooklyn subtly shifted her weight. Even from 50 feet away, Cole could see the infinitesimal tightening around her eyes. She was exhausted, drained by the parasitic energy of the people surrounding her. Slowly, under the guise of taking a sip from her water glass, Brooklyn's gaze drifted away from the table. She scanned the perimeter of the room, bypassing the billionaires and the flashing cameras, searching the shadows. She knew his habits. She knew where the blind spots in the room were. Through the crowded, noisy ballroom, her eyes found his silhouette half hidden behind the marble pillar. For a span of 3 seconds, the entire gala faded into white noise. Across the distance, a silent, desperate conversation passed between them. Her eyes pleaded for an anchor. His presence, despite the agony tearing him apart, offered one. Brooklyn let out a slow, stabilizing breath, the tension in her shoulders visibly releasing just from knowing he was there standing guard in the dark. But the tether between them was too strong, the energy too palpable. At the table, Amanda noticed the sudden shift in her idol's demeanor. She stopped mid-sentence, her brow furrowing, as she followed the trajectory of Brooklyn's gaze. Amanda's eyes swept past the centerpieces, past the waitstaff, cutting a direct path toward the South Service doors. Cole's blood turned to ice. He didn't panic. He didn't flinch. With the terrifying, practiced precision of a man who had erased his own existence, Cole took one silent, fluid step backward, letting the heavy black velvet drapes of the service corridor swallow him completely, just a fraction of a second before Amanda's gaze reached the pillar. Hidden in the suffocating darkness of the drapery, Cole stopped breathing. Through the narrow slit in the fabric, he saw Amanda squinting at the empty shadows, a sudden confused unease washing over her meticulously powdered face. She didn't see him, but the phantom weight of his presence had brushed against her reality. The puzzle pieces were on the table, and Cole knew with a sinking, terrifying certainty that it was only a matter of time before they began to lock together. The aftermath of the charity gala left the St. James feeling like a hollowed-out theater. It was nearly 2 in the morning. The grand chandeliers of the mezzanine had been dimmed to a bruised, low-voltage amber, casting long, undisturbed shadows across the thick carpets. Cole walked beside Brooklyn down the secluded VIP corridor leading to the private penthouse elevators. The oppressive, suffocating weight of the evening had finally lifted. Brooklyn held her velvet heels in one hand, walking barefoot, leaning infinitesimally into Cole's space. For the first time in hours, Cole allowed the rigid tension in his spine to ease, the sanctuary of the 50th floor finally within reach. Just around the corner, separated by a heavy marble archway, stood Amanda. She had left Brock at the lobby bar after a hushed, venomous argument over his drinking. Seeking the quiet isolation of the mezzanine to reapply her lipstick and patch together her composure, she had frozen when she heard the soft, unmistakable cadence of Brooklyn Taylor's voice echoing down the hall. Amanda stepped closer to the edge of the archway, her heart giving a pathetic, involuntary flutter at the thought of catching one more glimpse of the woman she idolized. She peered into the dimly lit corridor. Brooklyn was there, her back to Amanda, bathed in the soft glow of the elevator call button. But she wasn't alone. She was speaking softly privately to the tall man standing beside her. Amanda's eyes shifted to the escort. First it was the posture, the impossibly straight line of his shoulders, the quiet, commanding way he occupied space. Then the man turned his head to look down at Brooklyn, and the ambient light cut sharply across the familiar angles of his profile. The breath violently evacuated Amanda's lungs. Her monogrammed clutch slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the thick carpet with a muted thud. Cole. It wasn't a trick of the lighting. It wasn't a ghost born from the buried, rotting guilt she carried. It was her husband. The man who had vanished without a trace 334 days ago, leaving her to drown in the chaotic ruin of their marriage while Brock slowly revealed himself to be a miserable, controlling mistake. Amanda pressed her back against the cold marble wall, her trembling hands flying up to cover her mouth as a wave of sheer, terrifying nausea washed over her. He wasn't dead. He wasn't broken in some squalid apartment. He was here standing in a flawlessly tailored suit projecting absolute authority. And then the second, infinitely more devastating realization hit her. Through the gap in the archway, Amanda watched Brooklyn Taylor, the woman whose life she coveted, the woman she had practically begged for 2 minutes of attention earlier that evening, reach out. Brooklyn's hand rested gently, intimately against the lapel of Cole's suit. Cole didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his hand, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair from Brooklyn's face with a devastating, unguarded tenderness Amanda hadn't seen in years. The world did not just tilt, it shattered into jagged, bleeding pieces. Cole was the one guarding her idol. Cole was the man Brooklyn Taylor looked at with absolute, unfiltered trust. The poetry of the punishment was so precise, so unimaginably cruel, that Amanda felt her knees begin to give out. Down the corridor, the elevator arrived with a soft, melodic chime. The sound seemed to snap the fragile silence in half. Cole's head jerked up, his predatory instincts flaring. He looked directly down the hallway past the dim lighting, straight into the shadows of the marble archway. Amanda froze a sob, trapped in her throat, her tear-filled eyes locking with his across the 50 feet of heavy silence. The absolute freezing void in Cole's stare confirmed everything. He had known she was here. He had known everything all weekend, watching her play a pathetic game of pretend. Without a word, without a single flicker of recognition or mercy, Cole turned his back on her. He guided Brooklyn into the elevator, and the steel doors slid shut, sealing Amanda in the cold, devastating dark of her own making. The heavy oak door of the executive suite clicked shut behind Cole. It was 6 a.m., the hour when the St. James was suspended in the quiet, bruised light of a Manhattan dawn. He had barely slept, the adrenaline of the previous night's near miss still humming faintly in his veins. He turned toward the private elevators, his mind already categorizing the day's corporate crises. Cole. The voice was a fractured, desperate rasp. Cole stopped. He didn't flinch. Slowly he turned his head. Amanda emerged from the deep shadows of the alcove near the emergency stairwell. The flawless, curated socialite from the gala was entirely gone. She was wearing the same camel hair trench coat from yesterday, hastily thrown over her shoulders. Her hair was a tangled mess, and the remnants of last night's mascara were smudged into dark, hollow stains beneath her eyes. She looked small, trembling violently under the harsh fluorescent security lights. Cole stood perfectly still, his hands resting easily in the pockets of his tailored trousers. He braced himself for the surge of panics, violent spike of rage he had feared for nearly a year. But as he looked at her, now stripped of the memories he had agonized over for 335 days, he felt nothing. Only a profound, echoing apathy. How did you bypass the security fob on this floor? Cole asked, his voice deadened a purely administrative inquiry. Amanda let out a choked sob, stepping forward, though she instinctively stopped a few feet away, repelled by the invisible wall of ice radiating from him. I waited, she wept, her hands twisting the heavy fabric of her coat. I waited all night in the stairwell. Cole, please, you have to look at me. You have to talk to me. I'm looking at you, he replied, his tone unchanged. I was wrong, yeah. The words spilled out of her in a frantic, unbroken rush. Brock is a nightmare. He drinks, he's controlling, he doesn't see me. Not the way you did. Every day since you left, I've been drowning. I made a mistake, a horrible, stupid mistake, and I have paid for it every single second of this year. Please, Cole, I am begging you. Just yell at me. Tell me you hate me. Do something to show me you're still in there. She reached out a trembling hand, grasping for the sleeve of his dark suit jacket. Cole didn't step back. He simply looked down at her fingers until she, shaking uncontrollably, let her hand drop to her side. You want me to yell at you? Cole said softly, the quiet resonance of his voice echoing off the cold marble walls. You want me to scream, because if I scream, it means you still matter. It means your betrayal had enough power to destroy me permanently. You want me to give you the absolution of my anger, so you can feel justified. Amanda stared at him, tears carving clean lines down her ruined makeup, her chest heaving as she struggled for air. But I'm not angry, Amanda. Cole continued, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying, vacant calm. I was dead for a few months. And then I woke up. And when I woke up, I realized the woman I was mourning never actually existed. You were just a mirror, reflecting whatever you thought the world wanted to see. Even yesterday, you were wearing someone else's clothes, repeating someone else's words, desperate to be acknowledged by a woman whose life you know absolutely nothing about. Amanda flinched as if she had been struck across the face. The mention of Brooklyn Taylor was a jagged blade twisting directly into her ribs. You're not here because you love me, Cole said, his voice dropping to a harsh final whisper. You're here because the raft you built out of my bones is sinking and you don't know how to swim. Amanda clamped both hands over her mouth, a guttural sound of pure, unadulterated grief tearing from her throat. She sank to her knees right there on the pristine carpet, her facade completely collapsing as she wept into the empty air. Cole looked down at her one last time. He felt the ghost of his marriage finally exhale its last breath and vanish into the cold hallway. Security will escort you back to your room, Cole said, turning his back on the weeping woman on the floor. He walked to the elevator, pressed the button for the penthouse, and never looked back. The heavy silence of the penthouse was shattered not by a scream, but by the sharp, terrifying slide of an iPad across the marble kitchen island. Cole stood near the espresso machine, his tie undone, watching the illuminated screen come to a halt. It was 8:30 a.m. Outside, the Manhattan skyline was obscured by a thick, oppressive gray fog mimicking the sudden claustrophobia within the room. On the screen was a photograph. It was grainy, shot with a high-powered telephoto lens through a gap in the mezzanine's architectural draping. It captured the exact moment from the night before, just outside the private elevators. Cole's hand was resting intimately on the lapel of Brooklyn's jacket, his thumb brushing her jawline. The vulnerability in her eyes, the protective dominance in his posture, it was an unmistakable, deeply private confession of love, now plastered across the homepage of every major celebrity news outlet in the country. Lifestyle icon Brooklyn Taylor's secret romance with mystery hotel executive. From the speakerphone resting next to the tablet, the frantic, shrill voice of Brooklyn's lead publicist, Eleanor, filled the room. The narrative is spinning out of control. Eleanor barked, the sound of rapid typing echoing in the background. They've already identified him. Cole Williams, managing director of the St. James. The board of directors is going to lose their minds over a breach of guest management protocol. In Brooklyn, your investors are calling. Your entire brand is built on independent, untouchable empowerment, not sneaking around service corridors with hotel staff. Brooklyn sat on the velvet bar stool wearing a silk robe, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. She didn't look at the tablet. She was looking at Cole. We issue a statement immediately, Eleanor continued, ruthless and efficient. We say he was acting as supplementary security, that the angle of the photo is misleading. We demand a retraction, we threaten a defamation suit, and we kill this story by noon. Cole, you agree to step back, take a leave of absence, and we completely sever public ties. It's the only way to protect the brand. Cole looked at the photograph. He thought of the life he had built from the ashes of Chicago, a quiet, perfectly controlled existence where no one could touch him. If this escalated, the St. James board would terminate him by the end of the day. He would be thrust into the spotlight, dissected by the media, and his humiliating, legally unresolved marriage to Amanda would inevitably be dragged into the public eye. The easiest thing to do was disappear. It was his specialty. Do it, Cole said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He looked up, his eyes meeting Brooklyn's. Draft the statement, Eleanor. I was acting as security. It's over. Brooklyn's breath hitched. She saw exactly what he was doing. He was falling back on his trauma response. He was falling on his sword to preserve her illusion, retreating into the void, just as he had done when his marriage collapsed. No, the word was quiet, but it cut through the room like a gunshot. Cole froze. On the phone, Eleanor stopped typing. Brooklyn, be reasonable. I said no, Brooklyn repeated, her voice steadying as she reached out and pressed the mute button on the phone, cutting Eleanor off completely. She stood up, walking around the marble island until she was standing inches from Cole. She reached out her fingers, gently tracing the hard, tense line of his jaw, mirroring the exact gesture from the leaked photograph. You spent the last year erasing yourself because someone made you feel like you weren't worth the truth. Brooklyn whispered, her eyes fiercely locked onto his, stripping away the final layers of his defense. I am not Amanda. I am not going to build my life on a lie, and I am not going to let you disappear again. Cole stared down at her, the walls of his fortress finally permanently collapsing. The terror of being seen was entirely eclipsed by the profound, terrifying realization that for the first time in his life, someone was willing to lose everything just to keep him in the light. The suite on the 40th floor was suffocatingly quiet. Amanda zipped her leather suitcase, the sharp metallic sound grating against the heavy silence. Brock's side of the bed had not been slept in. He had taken an early flight back to Chicago after their vicious argument at the lobby bar, leaving her with nothing but the hotel bill and the devastating wreckage of her own choices. She slipped the camel hair trench coat over her shoulders out of habit. But as she caught her reflection in the full-length mirror, a violent wave of nausea washed over her. The coat wasn't hers. The persona wasn't hers. She was merely a hollow imitation of a woman who was currently being loved by the husband she had thrown away. Amanda slowly took the coat off, letting it fall into the trash bin. She left the key cards on the nightstand and walked out the heavy door, clicking shut on her fabricated life forever. 50 floors above, the rhythmic ticking of the vintage Patek Philippe echoed in the executive office. Cole stood by the floor-to-ceiling window one last time, looking out at the chaotic, sprawling grid of Manhattan. He turned around and placed his master key card, the symbol of his absolute control, the lock to his fortress, precisely on the center of the mahogany desk. Sarah stood by the door holding his signed letter of resignation. The board of directors had been predictably furious about the leaked photograph, but Cole had preempted their disciplinary hearings with a swift, unarguable exit. Are you certain about this, Mr. Williams? Sarah asked quietly, her usual professional detachment slipping to reveal genuine regret. The St. James won't be the same without you. That is exactly why I have to leave, Cole replied, a faint, authentic smile touching his lips. I've spent the last year haunting this building. It's time to actually live. He picked up his overcoat and walked out. He didn't take the hidden service elevator. He didn't check the security feeds. He stepped into the main guest elevator, letting the descent carry him toward the unpredictable noise of the real world. When the polished steel doors parted at the lobby level, the afternoon sun was pouring through the atrium glass, fracturing into brilliant shards of light across the marble floor. The lobby was buzzing with a tense electric energy. Beyond the main revolving doors, a sea of paparazzi had gathered, their telephoto lenses pressed against the glass, hungry for the scandal of the decade. Cole ignored them. His eyes found the center of the room. Brooklyn was waiting for him. She wasn't wearing a power suit or a curated designer gown. She wore faded denim, a simple black sweater, and her face was completely bare of makeup. She had stripped away the idol, leaving only the woman. Her publicist, Eleanor, stood a few feet away, furiously typing on a phone, having finally lost the battle to control the narrative. Cole walked across the floor, the distance closing between them, permanently erasing the final boundary of his isolation. He didn't stop a polite 2 feet away. He closed the gap completely, his hand finding hers, their fingers interlacing with a firm, undeniable permanence. Brooklyn looked up at him, the heavy, exhausting burden of her fame momentarily eclipsed by the quiet strength of his grip. Ready? She asked, her voice steady and clear. I have been for a year, Cole answered. Together they turned toward the revolving doors. They didn't duck their heads. They didn't retreat to the loading dock. As they stepped out onto the pavement of Fifth Avenue, the world erupted into a blinding, deafening storm of flashbulbs and shouting reporters. Cole wrapped his arms securely around Brooklyn's waist, guiding her through the chaos. He didn't flinch. The ghost of his past was finally dead, left behind in the cold, empty corridors of the St. James. He was a man standing in the light, completely unhidden, ready to face whatever came next.